Good evening, everyone. My name is Elliot Ruga. I'm the Policy and Communications Director of the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. Welcome to our continuing series of conversations on topics about the natural and cultural resources of the New Jersey Highlands and beyond. Tonight's program is Butterflies Lost with Sharon and Wade Wander. We have lost an alarming number of New Jersey's butterfly species, and many are yet imperiled. Is this a reflection of a worldwide insect apocalypse? Sharon and Wade Wander are founding members of the New Jersey Butterfly Club. They're here to tell us about what's going on with these amazing creatures here in New Jersey and the world, and what's at stake. Sharon and Wade are environmental consultants, and as I mentioned, they're founding members of the New Jersey Butterfly Club, and they are very key members of the New Jersey Highlands Coalition Natural Heritage Subcommittee. So Sharon and Wade, love that you're here tonight. How are things?
Terrific, Elliot. Thank you.
Very good.
So tell us about butterflies.
Well, there's about 125 species of butterflies, depending upon your taxonomy, in New Jersey. And as you mentioned, we've lost a substantial number of those since World War II, let's say, roughly about 10%. And the same could be said of our population of moths as well, the species of moths. We've lost a considerable number of moth species as well. So this was a program that we offered to the New Jersey Butterfly Club a few months ago. And Zach thought it might be a good fit for this group. So we're here to talk about those species that have been lost, those species which are in danger of being lost, and speculation about some of the reasons why they've been lost or they're declining, all set against the backdrop of this overall idea that insects are declining precipitously worldwide.
Well, we're thrilled you're here tonight, and I understand you have some slides to show us. And
yeah, we've got about 500 slides, Elliot, so we got to get through it pretty quickly.
Okay.
it's all yours, Wade.
Okay. So Sharon put together this snappy opening slide here about one of these species that we've recently lost, the Silverboarded Fritillary. And this is just one example of many of the species that we've lost. In many cases, we really don't have a very good idea about why they disappeared or why other species are declining. So we're going to be discussing some ideas about that. And we go back as far as World War II, basically the 1950s, because there is some information dating back that far, but to go back further than that, things do get a bit dicey. So no doubt, many of you have seen headlines, these headlines perhaps, or similar ones, that have been taken up by the popular press, who have learned this from some scientific studies that have come out, basically more in Europe than any place else, but we do have some long-term studies now from other parts of the world, and more are ongoing all the time, about this so-called insect apocalypse. So what we're going to discuss today is the decline of butterflies in New Jersey and how that relates to or how it may relate to the overall decline in other parts of the world. So there's scientific evidence on which some of those headlines were based. And then there's also anecdotal evidence, which many people kind of ignore, but I think it's important, particularly if it's repeated over years and in various parts of the world. And one of the things that people my age have probably noticed is that you don't find much in the way of sticky bugs crashing into your windshield anymore. It used to be that you'd have to pop out of your car every time you got gas and get the squeegee and squeegee off these sticky insects. Well, when's the last time you had to do that? I can't remember the last time I've had to do it. So there seems to be, at least based upon this, a decline in flying insects at any rate. And studies have more or less in various parts of the world shown this, as well as a decline in ground dwelling insects as well. So we call this the windshield effect, and could call it the headlight effect or the grill effect. So here are the 14 species that,
Okay.
oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here are the 14 species that we've lost since roughly World War II. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this table because we're going to be discussing most of these species individually. But you can see the dates are not firm because we simply do not have specific years that we know when these butterflies were lost. We can simply speculate, sometimes just into decades or sometimes several decades. And you can see more recently, the data has become much more reliable, and now we have specific years beginning around the 1980s when species were lost, which coincides with a great uptick in butterfly observation by amateurs. And then under reason, we speculate as to why they may have declined. And again, let me emphasize, this is just speculation. There is some circumstantial evidence, certainly, but nothing really too firm. Now we're going to proceed to another table here about 21 resident New Jersey species that we have determined are in trouble. And you can see the list on the left. Again, we're going to be going through most of these species individually. And again, the reasons for their decline and their vulnerability here on the right. Now, Sharon and I have lived in the same house in Sussex County since 1989. And we've kept records of butterflies virtually daily since 1992. So we have almost 30 years of observations on our property. And the surrounding properties really haven't changed much. There hasn't been much in the way of building. The only thing that's really changed is an increase in alien invasive plants. But we still pretty much have the same habitats. The woods are still totally denuded by deer, particularly the upland woods. So here's a table of species that we have lost in our yard. And this is symptomatic of a more general decline, at least in most of New Jersey and other states. So you can see here that the coral hair streak, for example, our last record was 1995. We do not know why it has disappeared, but compare that with the one below it, dusted skipper, last observation in 1997, and we can pretty much link that to the actions of the eastern phoebe, which is a sort of a flycatcher. What happened was a pair of eastern phoebes decided to nest on our house, and they're an early nester, and the dusted skipper happens to be an early emerging species of butterfly. So when March came around and the dusted skipper started to fly, the nesting eastern phoebe found it easy pickings and knocked them all off to feed its young. There were only 3 or 4. It was a small population, but this points out the vulnerability of very small populations. There are many stressors can eliminate a population, even just one stressor or a combination of some. And then you see the other species here, Compton Tortoiseshell, Aphrodite, Long Dash, and the bottom one, Indian Skipper, are all northern species. And there may be some link to climate change, as northern New Jersey is on the periphery of their range here. Now, next, we're going to discuss some possible reasons for the decline of one or more species. That should be coming up shortly on your screen. I apologize for this delay. Here we go. So spraying of DDT, you're probably all familiar with that as it relates to bald eagles and other raptors. But that began right after World War II. There were some controls instituted after that, and the use was prohibited in the 70s. And then after that, we have aerial spraying of BT to kill gypsy moths. So that comes under the category of pesticides, which is a common reason that people have put forward for the decline of butterflies and moths in particular. Reforestation, a lot of open habitats favored by butterflies have been lost. For a few species, collecting has been a problem. Again, this gets to the point of very small populations being vulnerable. Deer population, we have an overpopulation of deer. We've had it for some time. And they browse host plants, which are native species, and other species of native vegetation, for example, nectar sources. So that hasn't helped. Management activities on utility lines. A lot of butterflies are found on utility lines. Utility line is an opening that's crossing through an otherwise forested habitat, and you find a lot of butterfly action, a lot of diversity in utility lines. So it's important as to how they're managed or not managed, as the case may be. And then we have, and I can't emphasize this enough, a massive increase in invasive introduced vegetation. They've gone crazy. Many species have a direct impact on host plants for butterflies. We know that several populations have been lost due to the host plant being swamped by alien invasive plants, like, for example, stiltgrass and Asiatic bittersweet, not to mention some of the terrible shrubs like autumn olive. And then there's climate change, which most of you are probably intimately familiar with. So you can see the figure there at the bottom, how things are warming up. And that has a number of impacts or potential impacts on butterflies, some of which you really probably wouldn't think of right away. And we're going to be discussing that later on as well. So you can have direct mortality of adults and larvae from severe storms. This is the next slide coming up. Come on, dude. Oh, here we go. So drought. Many parts of the world are affected by drought, and this has a serious effect on, or at least it's thought, on butterflies. And that's particularly true out west, down in the southeastern states and in other parts of the world. And of course, climate change, one of the tenets of climate change is more and more severe storms. Things like hail can have a direct mortality on butterflies, and of course, fires as well. And related to that is desiccation from severe heat and drought, which can affect the loss of host and nectar plants. Then there's the change in phenology, leading to mismatched timing with host plants. So the butterflies may be emerging at different times than the host plants now. And an increase in pathogens, particularly fungi, increase in predators and parasitoids. A lot of this stuff really hasn't been studied much. So again, this is somewhat speculative. And one of Sharon's favorites that she's come up with is loss of snow cover protection for overwintering larvae and pupae. It's all, it's amazing how many species of butterflies overwinter in grass on the ground. And it's a reasonable question to ask if the lack of snow cover has anything to do with the mortality of larvae and pupae. So, all right, so we're gonna, I don't know if we're gonna be, oh, and then there's, the next slide indicates pesticide spraying, which is coming up shortly, which is often done along power lines to kill woody vegetation. And as I mentioned before, this is where a lot of our butterflies can be found, is in these linear openings of utility lines. And so that's a potential problem as well. So now let's talk about invasive plant species. We've had a lot of firsthand experience with this in trying to clear out a lot of invasive species from a colony of northern meadowlarks, which is an endangered species in New Jersey, and arguably really one of our most imperiled species, as we only have just a couple, two or three colonies left in northern New Jersey. So the things that we have to clear out include oriental bittersweet, autumn olive, honeysuckle shrub, stiltgrass, and in this particular location, Carline thistle. And there's more on the way, and it gets very difficult because a lot of this stuff grows so rapidly, you really have to get out there every year to clear it out. Otherwise, it would totally cover up the host plant, which is round-leaved ragwort.
Definitely.
It's the only host plant for northern meadowlark. So this, as you can imagine, is very labor intensive. And it's difficult to do, particularly when you get into middle age. And then there's accelerated vegetation succession by invasive shrubs. That's what you see right now. So we follow up here where we live in northwestern New Jersey. We found a lot of sites for uncommon to rare species. So in 2002, in the upper left there, you can see a nice open field, a grassy field, as part of Swartzwood State Park now. And it had a nice population of long dash, and long dash being a species of skipper butterfly. And a lot of people went to this particular location to see it because it wasn't terribly widespread or common. And then you see in the lower right, a very similar photo, but taken in 2015. You can see the invasion of that field by mostly multiflora rose and autumn olive. So in 2015, no long dash. And it's a nice, this is one of those northern species. So climate change may have an impact, but certainly loss of suitable habitat as well. Next slide is human-caused habitat alteration. So a lot of us are familiar with a lot of residential development, which has slowed considerably lately. But for a while, post-World War II, and then after that, when the economy was booming and the soldiers were home, there was a great deal of building that took place. So a lot of open habitat was lost. And then there's a lot of agriculture that takes place, which of course is not particularly good for butterflies and other insects for that matter, particularly monocultures. So the photo in the lower right is of a place that we follow that's part of the Jenny Jump State Forest. And this is an open field here, an agricultural field normally planted in corn, but sometimes in soybean. And what the farmer has done here is he's tried to plant all of this field, even the parts that are too wet to grow corn. And that part is right adjacent to the purple loosestrife that you see in the photograph. So the wetland here is very butterfly friendly, despite the invasive purple loosestrife. There's a lot of butterflies seen in this area. So what we're trying to convince the state to do is to convince the farmer to not try and disc that area or plow it or plant corn or do anything like that. It's a modified agricultural wetland. It ought to be let go. Of course, we can't let it go too far because it'll grow up an invasive shrub. So a deal would have to be struck with the farmer to mow it. Okay, so let's get to some individual species here. The first, well, perhaps the first that we lost is Appalachian Grizzled Skipper. This was found in the trap rock areas in the northeastern part of the state primarily, but also elsewhere in North Jersey. And this is the decline and disappearance of this species has been linked to the aerial spraying of BT to control gypsy moths, because the decline was noted at just about the same time as aerial spraying took place. Also, this is an early emerger, this butterfly, and the caterpillars are active just about at the same time spraying takes place, which in North Jersey would be in the second half of May. And the caterpillars could be very vulnerable to that sort of thing. This is a forested species as well. So where does gypsy moth spraying take place? Well, in forests. So there's a strong circumstantial case to be made about Grizzled Skipper and BT spraying. Now, the next image here, you may be able to make out these little pink dots. These represent actual sightings of Grizzled Skipper in the DEP database at Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife. So none of these exist anymore. This butterfly is gone for some time now, and in fact, it's disappeared from a lot of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Mottled dusky wing, similar situation here. It's a forest opening, forest edge kind of butterfly. We think it disappeared sometime around the 1970s. The host plant is still around, and that's true of almost every species we're going to be talking about here today. It is not a question of loss of host plant. Host plants are still around, sometimes common. So that cannot explain the loss of these species, in this particular case, New Jersey tea. So this has disappeared for a while, and the yellow dots indicate records in North Jersey where there were specimens collected. A similar case can be made for the very plain and unassuming West Virginia white. Same thing, this is a forested species. It only has one brood. It emerges early, and the caterpillar pretty much at the same time, late May, when the spraying takes. And you can see there's very few records here. Caterpillars feed on Dentaria, which is toothwort, which is still around. It's by no means rare. And the other thing that's been linked to the decline of West Virginia white is the increase in garlic mustard. It's been demonstrated that the garlic mustard has lethal and sublethal effects on caterpillars of West Virginia white, but the West Virginia white seems, the garlic mustard seems irresistible to the West Virginia whites, at least in some populations. We don't know what happened with the silvery checker spot, but that's declined, and it's now gone from New Jersey. Pesticides are implicated in this disappearance as well. And when we gave this program about 2 months ago to the Bird Club, we had a friend from New York tuned in. And this is one that you don't anticipate in giving a program, because we had originally thought that this disappeared in the 60s or 70s, but then he kindly provided us with this image of one that was photographed at Greenbrook Sanctuary by him in Bergen County in 1986. So that pushes the disappearance date quite a bit. And I don't know whether anyone's even gone back there to check for this thing. Moving right along to one of our showiest and most attractive butterflies, the regal fritillary. Disappeared sometime in the 60s and 70s. I think there's a pretty strong link to the loss of very large early successional fields in the disappearance of this beautiful butterfly. The nearest population, and one of only two really east of Indiana, is at Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. And they monitor and manage for regal fritillary there. It's a large military installation, and it's been shown that regal fritillary, unlike other fritillaries, require large tracts of land of open suitable habitat loaded with violets, but not just any violet. It's been demonstrated that the caterpillars do much better on certain species of violets. So this becomes very, very complicated. And in New Jersey, we don't have these large sorts of fields anymore. Sadly, it's all been chopped up. And so we've lost this sometime in the 60s or 70s. And here's another one coming up, the Mitchell Seder. Perhaps some of you have heard about this. This was a North Jersey specialist, particularly northwestern New Jersey. It was a limestone species, limestone fens in particular. And it never was, as far as we can tell, going back into the literature, it never was a particularly common butterfly and was very desirous on the part of collectors. And it was found in a few different fens up here in Warren and Sussex counties. But there were a lot of collectors who had their eyes on this particular butterfly. And we think that collecting was primarily responsible for the demise of this species, again, pointing out the vulnerability of very small populations. So we're not going to see this in New Jersey again. This was photographed in Alabama, actually, oddly enough, in a roadside ditch. Next up is Harris's checker spot. Sharon and I were lucky enough to find a couple of sites that supported this species in the northwestern part of the state. And this disappeared sometime in the late 90s. There was a report from 2003, which we're not exactly sure about. But at any rate, this is another one of these peripheral species that's found up in New England and then down a little bit to our south at higher elevations in the mountains. So climate change is implicated with this species as well. Certainly the food plant is really not rare. It's a species of aster. I know it as Aster umbellatus, a flat-top white aster, but the taxonomists like to annoy me by changing names, which I cannot keep up with. And here's a little beauty, Arctic skipper. This was another very northern species, as you can tell from the name. This is a New England and southern Canada specialist. And in New Jersey, as far as we know, it was only found in one site, and that was up at High Point State Park. It was discovered by a friend of ours in 1986. And by 2005, it was gone already. That was the last year it was seen. Tiny population. We never saw more than 15 to 20 individuals at any one time. And so climate change seems a likely suspect in this. But again, with a low population, it could have been any one of many stressors. What?
Collecting.
Oh, and there's also collecting. It's a desirable species. It's small, but it's beautiful. And knowledge of this population probably seeped out beyond the butterfly community and into the collecting community. We don't know this for sure, but it's a possibility. Acadian hairstreak is a little beauty, one of many hair streaks in New Jersey. Again, another northern species who may be victimized by climate change. Although in the old days, you do see records, specimen records down in the central and even southern part of the state. And that's a common theme too for species that were distributed throughout New Jersey. You see the disappearance from southern counties progressively northward as the years slip by. And also this one we suspect is having some sort of an ant association like other hair streaks have. And so this could be a factor as well. If the ant disappears, then the butterfly disappears. But this has disappeared also from adjacent sections of Pennsylvania and New York
Just
as well.
explain ant association. We'll look at the ants tend the larvae.
Yeah, the ants tend the larvae. So, you know, the ants get the nice syrupy juice produced by the larvae, and the larvae get the protection of the ants. And this is one that we started out with in the first image, was the Silverboarded Fritillary. We've been following populations of this in New Jersey for quite some time. And 2012 was the last year we observed it in the Delaware Water Gap Recreation Area. There was a bog up there that had a small population, about 10, 15 individuals that were hanging on. And that eventually disappeared as well, a real little beauty. And this was also found down south as well. But again, it disappeared in the southern counties before it disappeared up here.
Talk about. I'm going to bust in here. The fritillaries are a group that kind of sparked my thinking that maybe lack of snow cover was a contributing factor, because fritillaries overwinter as first instar larvae. The first, as soon as they come out of the egg, they basically go into torpor near their food plant and hibernate. So this is an extremely tiny little organism at that stage. And one can easily envision that direct exposure to winter temperatures, even if they're a little warmer than they used to be, could have a deleterious effect. Whereas these butterflies evolved with extensive snow cover for most of the winter that may have protected the larvae. So that's what underlies my snow cover theory.
Okay, I've used up a little bit more than my allotted half hour. And so we're not quite halfway through the program. So Sharon's going to be guiding us through the declining species of butterflies, and then what we can do perhaps to ameliorate some of these declines.
Okay, and I'm starting out with a butterfly that's not really declining. It's actually one of the few that we're seeing increase. It's the southern species that's increasing, potentially as a result of climate change. Surprisingly, we haven't had a lot of that. Very few butterfly species seem to occur sporadically a little more than they used to, but sleepy orange seems to be establishing some resident populations. There's a good population at Duke Farms in Somerset County, and also down along the Delaware Bay shore at some of the wildlife management areas. But these are small populations, and they are subject, particularly on the wildlife management areas, to management whims. If the manager at the time likes the field filling up with the senna, that's its food plant, well, that's fine. If the manager decides, well, we don't want this here anymore, let's mow it, the sleepy orange is out of luck. So small populations and scattered locations are extremely vulnerable. And this is true for many of the things we're going to talk about. We still have frosted elfin. The frosted and hoary elfins are members of our hair streak guild. And they occur, frosted elfin formerly occurred throughout New Jersey. And the north, when they occurred in the north, that was before our time. And they may have the caterpillars may have fed on lupin up here, but down south, where the only populations are now, they feed on wild indigo. And occur in little colonies, and those are in utility rights of way. And there again, we have management vulnerability, because every so often the utility company comes through and discs the habitat. And that doesn't do very well for wild indigo, which is the food plant. And the population may plummet or even disappear. But luckily, this one seems to have a fairly good dispersal capability, so they still hang on. Within the time that we've been butterflying, we lost a colony at Assunpink Wildlife Management Area. That was not the fault of management, it was the fault of deer. Deer went in and browsed the wild indigo host plant there. So just one of those odd things that happens to a small colony. Hoary elfin is more of a central pine barrens inhabitant. It exists in fire-prone habitats. It both benefits from fire, which keeps the habitat open for its low-growing food plant bearberry. But if fire sweeps through a colony, such as the one at Warren Grove, in a recreation area, Warren Grove recreation area, it could wipe out a colony. So it's extremely vulnerable due to its scattered small colonies. Probably not a climate change effect on the elfins. And bronze copper. This is a butterfly that used to occur throughout New Jersey, from Delaware Bay shore north, but always kind of in smallish colonies. Here and there you would find a really good population. But now and it has really withdrawn. There's a few small occurrences down south, one of which is proven vulnerable to management. It occurred on a farm where the previous owner liked bronze coppers and probably other butterflies and managed the farm to benefit them. However, new owners are not doing the same, and the colony is not doing well. Right now in North Jersey, we know of only 2 or 3 reliable colonies. It tends to occur, you'll see erratic individuals, but actual colonies that you can find year after year are very hard to come by. But we did just find 2 new ones within the past couple of years, one of which feeds on knotweeds, which we hadn't seen before. They usually feed on docks. But bronze copper is just so erratic that it's hard to keep track of it. Very beautiful little butterfly. We all get a big thrill out of seeing. Next, we're going to talk about gray comma, which formerly occurred through much of North Jersey. There are specimens in North Jersey and down along the outer coast. Then it was kind of disappeared. Nobody saw it for years until our friend Paul Williams of the Butterfly Club discovered one at Horseshoe Bend Park in Kingwood Township, Hunterdon County. And it was subsequently discovered that there's quite a colony there. They feed on an endangered host plant, Missouri gooseberry. So luckily there's a robust population at this particular spot, but it is not widespread. And so the butterfly is not very widespread anymore. And this also, to a certain extent, depends on the rather capricious management of this particular site. We never know if they're going to clean out the hedgerows where the host plant grows, or whether invasive species are going to swamp the host plant. So it's a precarious situation for a really beautiful butterfly. Baltimore checker spot is a real heartbreaker.
Not up yet.
Certainly one of our most beautiful butterflies, as you can see. This formerly occurred pretty much throughout the state. It mostly inhabits wetlands here in New Jersey. Its main host plant is turtlehead. And I don't know if we've explained host plants for people who are not butterfliers, but host plants are the plants that the caterpillar stage eats and must have. Many species are tied to a single host plant, others to host plants within a single genus, like the asters, for example, and a very few have a wide variety of host plants that they can use. But many butterflies are tied very closely to the success of their host plant. But Baltimore has just totally withdrawn north. There's none in South Jersey anymore, and colonies in North Jersey are becoming harder and harder to find and smaller in numbers. There's also such a beautiful butterfly, worry about collecting. There is a community of collectors. The New Jersey Butterfly Club does not do any collecting. We purely use binoculars and cameras, but there is a community of entomologists out there that do collect. And so we worry about that. Compton Tortoiseshell, another highly likely climate change victim. We are at the southern end of its range, more or less, and a butterfly that used to be more widely reported. We had it here at our house when we moved in. As soon as we learned about butterflies, a few years after we moved in, we were thrilled to see that we had Compton Tortoiseshell here. We haven't had it in probably decades now. And mostly, as you can see, they're found in the very northernmost areas like the Pequannock watershed and Wawayanda. This is a very interesting butterfly that can have a lifespan of up to 10 months, which is really, really long. It overwinters as an adult and emerges early in the spring. So we're really sorry to lose Compton Tortoiseshell. As you can see, it has a wide variety of host plants, so that is not limiting the population. Oh, and this is our baby, the northern metalmark, which Wade mentioned before. Meadowlark is an extreme habitat specialist. Sorry, I'm forgetting the delay. It only occurs, it's in the limestone belt of Sussex and Warren counties. It inhabits grassy glades under eastern red cedar on limestone, and it has to support its host plant, which is roundleaf ragwort. This plant grows elsewhere. We have it here at our home, but we live on shale, so we don't have any meadowlarks. So being such a habitat specialist, once invasive species of plants came on the scene, this butterfly was in serious, serious trouble. As recently as the late 80s into the 90s, David Norris from Connecticut censused meadowlarks in the swath from Branchville to Hardwick Township and found numerous colonies with numerous individuals per colony. And now we have only 3 known colonies, one of which is pretty healthy. The other 2 are in serious, serious trouble because we can't keep out the invasive plant species. So that's a really sad story. We know what the problem is, and you just can't overcome the challenges. Brown is an inhabitant of large sedge meadows, and there aren't many of those left anymore. Until wetland regulations were enacted in the 80s, wetlands were things to be drained and subsequently built on. And so, large marshes were just eliminated. So the only ones left now that this species uses are up in Sussex County, along the Appalachian trail lands, and the Wallkill National Wildlife Refuge. But again, this is a species that has withdrawn northward. So it's pretty obvious that climate change is doing something here. And it's not the only inhabitant of marshes that is in trouble. The Georgia Seder, which occurs on the coastal plain in bogs and wet pine savannas, also it hasn't really withdrawn north, it's just declined in numbers and number of locations where it's found. And a big problem for this is collecting. A friend of ours found advertisements online for specimens of Georgia Seder mentioned as collected in New Jersey. So location of those few colonies that are known is now a closely guarded secret from South Jersey butterflyers who are trying to find them and protect them. But adding collecting pressure on top of any climate or other impacts is a big problem. Another one in the pines could potentially off-road vehicles. What better place to run your vehicle than into a bog or swamp? And that's where these butterflies live, and that does not help them out. But not everything in the pines dwells in swamps. There are also species that specialize in dry upland habitats. Cobweb skipper used to be abundant in habitats in South Jersey. It occurred throughout the state, but it was particularly common south of the Piedmont. But now we do not find it, or rarely find it in South Jersey. A couple of reports have come in recently. Now it's found on kind of dry, barren ridgetop areas or power lines, for example, where the blue stem food plants grow. So the withdrawal north certainly suggests some kind of habitat, some kind of climate impact to the little cobweb skipper. We were at a site just last Saturday, Mountainside Park in Pequannock, where we used to see it, and we did not find any this year and haven't been there in a couple of years. And now to a butterfly that Wade and I had a little bit to do with. This is a species with 2 disjunct populations. They may actually be sibling species. In New Jersey, it's never been conclusively demonstrated. There is or was a North Jersey population that occurred in Morris County basically on glacial outwash plain soils with the host plant, which is little blue stem. In Burlington and Ocean counties, basically on what is now Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst. It occurs in seasonally wet pine savannas and uses an entirely different host plant, pine barren reedgrass. So, and it has a slightly different flight period, time of emergence and flying. So it's kind of a bit of a mystery what's going on with the Orogo skipper, but what's not a mystery is that it's disappearing. Wade and I found it in the early 2000s in Morris County, and I'll show you the place where we found it, what it looks like now. It occurred around Suckasana in Morris County. And come on, map, here's the map. The overall area of this map is what's called the Suckasana Plains, which is a glacial outwash area. It has very dry, sandy soils, and it's flat, as the name suggests. So, wow, what a good place to build on. Just to give you orientation, up in the upper left here, this is the old Ledgewood Circle. This is Route 46 going across the top, and Route 10 is coming diagonally across here. We first found Orogo skipper down here in this one field. This is kept open, I'm not sure how, by the Morris County Municipal Utilities Authority. It's part of their well field. So it's a beautiful open field with many nectar sources. And this is where we, after another person had seen Orogo skipper along a railroad track over here, we searched there and didn't find it, but we found it here. And it also occurred on this power line. And up here at the top of the screen, there's this tiny little field adjacent to Route 46, where we found quite a good population one day on the first year we were looking for them. Admittedly, off-site to the top of this is Hercules, which is a former ammunition plant, I believe. It's a very big site, and it does have open fields. There were some in there, but we don't have access anymore, so we don't know if they're there. But here, this just shows you loss of habitat is a critical issue. I really think that the North Jersey population is confined to these glacial outwash soils, of which there's just almost none left. And those that are left are either forested, as we see in some areas, or totally built on. So Orogos is not standing a really big chance of surviving here, unfortunately. And it's a species that resembles another skipper that is still fairly common. This is Orogos down here. This is Delaware up here, which luckily we still have. And yeah, a casual glance, boy, these look pretty much the same. If you don't know to look for these faint pale veining on the hind wing of Orogos, and the fact that it has white fringes on the wings compared to orange fringes on Delaware. So this is just one instance of a long history of possible misidentifications, making it difficult to know the exact distribution and abundance of species, particularly as you go back in time, because some species have been separated recently, relatively recently, that were formerly considered single species, and some look so much alike that the average person really can't tell them apart. And so it throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into our attempts to develop some sort of historical picture of what many of these species, how they occurred in New Jersey. Here's another species that likes dry habitats, dotted skipper, basically an outer coastal plain specialist, which occurs, it's never far from fire maintained open areas. Again, you have the double-edged sword of it needs fire to maintain the grassy habitats that it needs, but it's vulnerable to potential destruction by fire. Though fires in New Jersey pinelands are not the extent of, for example, Western forest fires. They don't occur over such large areas. but it's when you have a very small population in a very small area, having it wiped out is very difficult. But there could be a climate issue here because the last known colony here was at Collier's Mills, which is in the northern part of the Pinelands. So we don't really know what's happening with dotted, but it's a possibility that it's not liking warmer temperatures. Here's another heartbreaker for us because we used to have Leonard Skipper right on our property. The first year we planted a butterfly garden, bingo. We said, what is this beautiful big skipper? Because this is large for a skipper. And we discovered it was Leonard's, which even then was sought after. But this is, I keep saying, this is another species that occurred almost throughout New Jersey in dry areas with blue stem grasses. But it liked to be near wetlands, which might have purple flowers. It likes blue and purple flowers to nectar on. So it liked, say, New York ironweed, for example, as a nectar source. So they were offering a combination of habitats. And this one definitely, this has disappeared from south to north and also noticeably from lower elevation to higher elevation. The two colonies now known are at high elevation on the Kittatinny Ridge, basically. So we don't know exactly what, but this is another species that overwinters as a larva. Most of the skippers do, and they're potentially vulnerable to cold and desiccation from lack of snow cover. Quickly, these long dash is a really pretty butterfly that we used to see fairly commonly in wet meadows. It was somewhat local, but some of those areas have been invaded by invasive species, speeding up habitat succession, development of some of the habitats, and other reasons are just kind of unknown. There's no obvious climate change impact here. So long dash is something we're just seeing disappear without a really good explanation. So they all kind of get climate change question mark because maybe it's in there, but we really don't have a specific thing we can pin it on. Except like all the skippers. Here's Indian skipper is another one in similar situation. They overwinter as larvae, and possible changes in winter conditions may be the problem. And they occur at a rapidly declining number of sites compared to where we used to see them. And so they're just vulnerable to random fluctuations in any kind of condition that could just wipe out populations. Then as each small one goes, there's less and less chance of recovery. Two-spotted skipper, another species. This occurred in the north and in the south, and the southern populations have disappeared. The northern populations are just very difficult to access, so we don't really know what's happening to two-spotted, but it has disappeared from all but possibly one of its southern New Jersey sites. Or it's 8 o'clock already. Okay, only a couple more to go. Pepper and salt, one of our favorites. This had Wade and David Ifner discovered a big colony in High Point State Park, and that one alarmingly has declined in numbers that we see. We used to see 20 or more. Now you're seeing single digits, even though a couple of new spots have been found in Hunterdon and Somerset counties with small numbers. So it's kind of going both ways with pepper and salt skipper. But hopefully maybe even more sites will be found. We can only keep our fingers crossed. And our last species is one of the now a butterfly found on only the topmost ridges of the Kittatinny, common roadside skipper. Used to be throughout the state, no longer is found commonly anywhere. We have to make special trips to the Kittatinny Ridge. We're going to make one this week to see if the very small population is still hanging on up there. We and another party are going to check the AT area this week. And as with so many of the others, things that have withdrawn north and to higher elevations, we're suspecting climate change. This is, not a spectacular butterfly that collectors are likely to go after. Although anytime something becomes rare, that piques the interest of collectors, and you just don't know what's going to happen. But we're trying to do a few things, most of them because we don't know what the problem is. There's very little specific that we can do, but the state has become very aware of and interested in pollinator protection and promotion. And so they are doing quite a bit of work trying to upgrade their wildlife management areas in particular to provide more pollinator habitat. And Columbia Wama is an example. In 2002, it was a great field with lots of milkweed and wild bergamot and all kinds of nice pollinator plants. By 2017, it was overrun with really thick with autumn olive. It's worse than it even looks from this aerial photograph. You couldn't hardly walk through it. But last year they cleared it out. They herbicided all the bad stuff, and they are going to seed it with a pollinator mix this year. And so hopefully we'd have a great improvement to report. So this kind of thing helps generalized species, maybe like Indian skipper, for example, that just inhabit flowery fields, and we not real habitat specialists. We have worked on the northern meadowlark extensively, as mentioned before. My picture isn't coming up here. Here we are. This is me planting black-eyed Susans, I think, at the glade. This is more or less how meadowlark habitat is supposed to look. It's got a few too many shrubs in it already, but it's supposed to be an open glade with grasses and nectar plants under these eastern red cedars, and underneath there is limestone. So we've done a lot with the New Jersey Butterfly Club and with the Ridge and Valley Conservancy to clear out vegetation. And as I said, it's a really tough go. We've worked closely with Robert Soames, who is the state entomologist in the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And he and his associates are also working nearby on White Lake Wildlife Management Area to clear out and improve habitat. Since this is one of the few species, we know what to do if only we can do it. So stopping there, these are things that we consulted to find out some of the historical occurrences of butterflies in New Jersey. And we also want to thank the many photographers, most of whom are with the New Jersey Butterfly Club, for allowing us to use their photos here. And with that, we will end, and you can ask questions, comments, and criticisms, if you like. We'd be happy to answer anything you may have.
8 o'clock, perfect.
Well, Sharon and Wade, thank you very much. I know I have lots of questions. People who are watching tonight have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and we will get to them. I do have a couple of housekeeping items. I want to talk about our upcoming event. We have the first New Jersey Highlands Coalition Hike-a-thon coming up June 1st through June 11th. That's a DIY event where you can hike, you can paddle, you can ride in the Highlands or wherever. It's your own route, it's your own time. Just keep track of it wherever you are, and you can win prizes and help raise awareness about protecting the critical natural resources in the Highlands, and incredible opportunities we have here in the Highlands for outdoor recreation. I'm putting a link in the chat where, if you're interested, you can find more information and register. Here we go. There we go. So the species we're talking about tonight, Sharon and Wade, are some moving north or south to more hospitable climates and disappearing from New Jersey due to climate change or other reasons, but not necessarily declining in overall numbers.
Uh, Most, I would say no, they're probably declining even to the north. I mean, we see them withdrawing from south to north across New Jersey. And I don't think many of them are moving into places where they didn't occur before. We're at the southern end of many of their ranges, and they're just withdrawing up into that area rather than the whole range moving north from New Jersey.
What's interesting is that we've lost 14 species, a lot of which were northern in distribution, and they've disappeared to our north. But we've only picked up perhaps one species moving from more southern areas into New Jersey, and that's the Brazilian skipper. Oddly enough, the other species that's invaded New Jersey, the common ringlet, has moved north to south. Beginning in the 1990s, it moved into the northern counties, and it's been as far south as Hunterdon and Somerset, but it seems to have stopped. Its southward progression seems to have stopped. But in general, almost all butterflies over the past several years have just declined. Every butterfly has commented on it. You can still get a pretty good species count if you spend a good part of a day out looking, but the numbers are just dreadful. One of this, two of that, three of that. It's not certainly what we used to find.
Okay. Well, Wade, we see your charming wife, but we only see half of you.
Oh.
Move a little closer to Sharon.
Sure. Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you. So,
There we go.
in residential areas, are there things people can do to encourage more native butterflies staying in the area? Are there butterfly gardens? And I mean, are we providing the same food for deer if we do that?
Well, you certainly have to plant native plants for butterflies. Some of them will use, there are a few species that use some non-native plants as host plants. Again, host plants are critical because that is what the caterpillars feed on. The adult female butterfly looks for her specific host plant. She detects it basically by tasting it with her feet. And when she finds what she's looking for, lays her eggs. And that has to be the plant that will support her future caterpillars. So there's a lot of information out there on the New Jersey Butterfly Club website and elsewhere about which plants to plant, both for nectar and both for host plants for caterpillars and for nectar for the adults, which of course is also important, but really critical to plant native plants. And it's not only herbaceous plants, a number of common species, for example, use tree foliage. Tiger swallowtail caterpillars feed on tulip tree and black cherry. A number of the hair streaks feed on oaks. And if anybody listening is a Doug Tallamy fan, you know he's just come out with a book about oaks and how wonderful they are for all kinds of Lepidoptera. So the big thing is, in general, to plant your property with native plants. And you can find information online about which are specifically good for butterflies and of course for moths as well, which are just as important.
We have many friends who live in the suburbs, sort of cheek to jowl with their neighbors, and they've been very successful in planting pollinator gardens. In fact, they let most of their yard go kind of wild, and of course then they're subject to nasty notes and left in their mailbox by their neighbors, but it's all worth it.
Yeah.
And easily done.
You just mentioned something, Sharon, that there are some species that feed on oaks and tulip trees. So there are forest species of butterflies as well. They're not all field and early successional dependent.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a whole group we really didn't mention much of here, the Seders, which are forest oriented. But many of the species that you see nectaring in fields, like tiger swallowtail and the other swallowtail, some of the other swallowtails are actually oriented toward forests and forest edges for their caterpillar host plants, which are shrubs and trees. So it doesn't have to be simply an herbaceous garden. You can introduce all kinds of native plants.
But there isn't much nectar for them in the forest, so you frequently see them in adjacent fields.
Right, right. How many butterflies do you need to have a colony? You're not just seeing a rare sighting that you know.
Well, I think that's changed over the years. Now 2 qualifies as a colony.
There's no official definition, but basically it's if a colony is if you're finding at least a few individuals in more or less the same spot year after year. You're persisting in the same area, rather than, as you said, just a flyby observation. But numbers don't come into the equation really.
And of course, the other complexity with studying insects is that they're notoriously for having boom and bust years. So the populations can not only drastically change from year to year, but from generation to generation for those species of butterflies that have multiple broods in a year. And this makes it very difficult to study and really requires really long-term, decades-long studies, because you can find in one year hundreds of oak-feeding hair streaks in a meadow next to a woodland, and then the next year, virtually nothing, even though nothing appears to have changed. And then someplace else in the state will have a big boom of hair streaks, the same species, and then the year after that, they're gone from there, at least temporarily. So it just really adds to the confusion of trying to study these species.
So you've seen species seemingly disappear and then reemerge?
Absolutely. Yep.
So for a beginner, where would you suggest they go to find a chart or to help them identify butterflies?
Well, first stop should be the website of the New Jersey Butterfly Club, which you can Google. There are species photos and species accounts for every butterfly in New Jersey. There's information on gardening, information on places to go. We strongly recommend that you invest in a field guide and in a pair of close focus binoculars. You can get Pentax Papilio binoculars for about $140. I just bought my latest pair, and they focus down. You want something close focusing. Birding binoculars don't work for butterflies because they don't focus close enough. It's usually 6 to 10 feet or something. Papilio's close focus down to 2.5 feet. And believe me, when you're looking at a little skipper on a flower, you appreciate that. You do need the tools, and you do need to study them a little bit. But the information is definitely out there, and there are still good places to go in just about every county to see butterflies. And we're just getting into good butterfly season now.
Just as a reference, a lot of these skippers that Sharon showed are roughly the size of a thumbnail.
Yeah, they look big on the screen, but they're pretty small.
So that would take a particular camera lens if you were shooting as well.
Camera.
Well, most of the photos that you saw in this program were taken by me, and just using a relatively inexpensive Canon point and shoot camera. It's a PowerShot SX70 that I use, and I just use, if I don't think I can get close to a subject, if I'm going to be 5-6 feet away or even more, I just use the telephoto feature. And then if I feel as if I can get close to a subject, I'll use the macro feature. And I just use the built-in flash. So you can take remarkably good pictures, certainly pictures good enough to be identified later on when you go back home and investigate things more closely or show it to other people. So you don't need thousands of dollars of worth of camera equipment. I've seen people take wonderful identifiable photos just with a phone camera.
Right, right. And I guess the caterpillars are accommodating enough that you're not having to chase them all over the place, that they'll remain in place for 60 seconds,
Oh,
hopefully.
yeah, they're easy to photograph if you can find them.
Right.
Many caterpillars, their mission in life is not to be seen, therefore not to be eaten by something. Some things like monarch caterpillars are flashy because they are advertising their toxicity. But probably the vast majority of butterfly caterpillars are rather cryptic and very small and hard to find. There is a reference, if you're intrigued by caterpillars, David Wagner has written Caterpillars of Northeastern North America, which is all you ever want to know about a whole lot of caterpillars. We find it, including moth caterpillars, which is really nice, because most of the caterpillars you'll find out in nature are going to be moth caterpillars, because there are 10 to 15 times as many species of moths as there are of butterflies. So
Right.
that's a whole other world out there.
Why don't you stop sharing screen and you can hold the book closer that
Okay.
people can see. There we go.
Okay, so, how do I get out of this?
You're good. You're good.
Okay,
You're good.
I gotta get out of this for me. Okay. Oops. Here is Wagner's
Oh, you know what?
Caterpillars of Eastern North America. And if you
I'm a
want to,
butterfly guy.
I got all the butterfly guides here. Here is, hold on just a second. They're all on the floor.
I'm gonna get a
You
pair of
can
pants.
do butterflies through binoculars. These are Jeffrey Glassberg's guides. He has East, West, all of North America. It's backwards, isn't it?
No, I see it.
But,
I see that correctly.
yeah, the type is backwards. And there's a new one, his Swift Guide to Butterflies of North America. But this is probably butterflies through the binoculars. The East is a good one to start with, because there's a smaller pool of butterflies that you have to learn, and more information about each one. And I was talking about binoculars. These are Papilio, Pentax Papilio 8.5 by 21 binoculars. Very, very light, easy to carry, and focus on your
Shoe
kneecaps.
tops.
Yeah, your shoe tops. And they're invaluable and relatively inexpensive.
Great. Here's a technical question. How much do tachnid flies affect butterfly populations?
The Acadian flies.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we don't really know. We know that tachinid flies have a very negative impact on several species of moths, particularly the larger giant silk moth population. Their decline has been linked to the increase in tachinid flies. Some of them were brought over as biological controls, believe it or not, to control gypsy moths. Gypsy moths are silk moths, and
Explain
But-
what they do.
yeah, I will. The tachinid fly that they brought over. Well, let me start with the gypsy moth. The gypsy moth only has one brood. So the tachinid fly, though, that they brought over to control the gypsy moth has several broods. So after it's done laying eggs on the gypsy moths, what are the subsequent broods of tachinid flies going to feed on? So they go after other related sort of species, which are our native species of silk moths. So back in the day, these biological controls were not really as properly vetted as they are nowadays. But butterflies are victims to parasites and parasitoids, just like moths are. But I'm not familiar with any studies about their negative impacts on any particular species of butterfly.
Right. So old unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
You mentioned about the collecting of butterflies. How strong a market is there for collecting, and is there anything meaningfully done to discourage collecting?
Well,
I think the number of collectors has dwindled over the years, but there's still I'm not part of that community, and so I don't really know. But there's a lot of trading that goes back and forth between collectors. So it's just not that they're being collected for commercial sale necessarily, although certainly that takes place. But a lot of collectors trade specimens, and they're always looking for something that's fresher, brighter, newer. So maybe their particular specimen that they have's gotten faded, and so now they want to get another one to replace it. We don't see that many people out in the field anymore with nets. And of course, I should add, I'm making a distinction between amateur collectors who collect for fun and for trading and for sale versus scientific collecting based upon, legitimate sort of scientific study,
Right.
by a university or something like that. That's different. Yeah, I think there's still a fair amount of it that goes on. And again, with very small, vulnerable populations, collecting isn't good.
Yeah.
Collectors do love to say that they do not impact populations, but they kind of ignore the fact that so many populations are so small now. And in fact, I was reading on online a few days ago about Baltimore checker spots in Massachusetts. This is way back in the 1700s. A collector said, "Oh, I collected 30 Baltimore checker spots out of this marsh and wherever near Boston, and I haven't seen any there since." So well, duh. It can have an impact, but there's no organized opposition to it. It is kind of a dwindling hobby, I would say.
And it may discourage you from giving out locations where you find something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we're very careful about that.
Ever since we found out about the Georgia Seders being offered online, we've been a little more cagey about reporting locations of really rare species.
Yeah. How far do these critters migrate?
Well, the monarch, of course, everybody knows about, down to Mexico or California,
Right.
or a little bit into Florida with some. But other species really don't undergo certainly the migration that monarchs do. In fact, you really can't call it a migration with other species. It's more of a dispersal. A migration kind of means a back and forth. And these things like red admiral or painted ladies, wonderful name for a butterfly, and snout butterflies, they undergo big movements, but technically they're really not migrations. If you want to see a migration or a movement of butterflies, a good place to go would be on the coast in the fall, where you can see monarchs and other species as well, and dragonflies too, for that matter, like Cape May.
Okay. Someone asks, they have numerous caterpillars on their dill and parsley plants,
Oh,
but they never find any chrysalis. What's happened to the caterpillars?
Well, most butterflies do not pupate on the host plant. These are, of course, black swallowtail caterpillars that the person has. And almost all caterpillars of any size anyway migrate away from the host plant. We call it going on safari, just a non-technical term, and they go off and find a suitable place to pupate. The black swallowtail will find a vertical attachment site, maybe up a sapling or a twig or on the side of your house, and it will attach its pupa there. Monarchs will go and they attach their chrysalis at an overhead location where it dangles, but they go quite far often from the host plant where they were feeding.
Gotcha. I wonder, can we get a little step up on climate change and start planting southern native plants here?
Well, some people are planting canna lilies, which is the food plant for Brazilian skipper, which is, becoming more and more common in Cape May. But as I said, there's been remarkably little obvious movement of southern species north yet. Perhaps one day we will see some species we don't have here, but I would rather you plant host plants for what's here now.
Yeah, yeah. And let climate change do the changing naturally. One last question. You mentioned knotweed as, I guess, a host plant. Is that the Japanese knotweed?
No.
Oh, heavens no.
No, oh, you want to answer?
Yeah, we would never recommend planting Japanese knotweed. That's quite successful on its own. What we're talking about are native polygonums, which many people may know as smartweeds. Like, well, there's many species. And that was mentioned in reference to the bronze copper, one of our endangered species of butterflies in New Jersey. Its normal host plant is dock, and that could be native species of dock or the alien curl dock. But apparently some populations are able to use of bronze copper, some populations are able to use polygonums. But if I'm a homeowner looking to plant a garden, I'm not going to plant polygonums or dock in the hope of attracting bronze copper. That's not going to happen. It's not a garden butterfly.
Right. Okay.
I mean, in most cases, you can't save most of these butterflies in your garden. What you can do is support the more generalist species that, for all we know, they're just so abundant that we don't realize that they may also be declining and need food plant and nectar support. Most of the rare ones are kind of habitat specialists or host plant specialists. And there's honestly a little that we can do as gardeners on our properties to help them out. But we can help out the larger community of butterflies that we still have. And that's really important.
The other thing that you can do is stop mowing your damn lawns and leave 10, 15, 20% of it left to go wild, and control the invasive species and plant milkweeds and plant wild bergamot and plant some other stuff. This will not only benefit the butterflies, but bees and a whole host of other insects, many of which are important pollinators.
And improve quality of stormwater.
Yes. Many benefits.
Less air pollution.
Yeah, many benefits. That's what we've done. Of course, some people attribute it to my laziness, but I've been cutting back on. We virtually have very little lawn left now.
Yeah, it's also easier to do and less expensive.
Yes.
Right.
All kinds of saving.
The main difference between moths and butterflies is they different times of day. Moths are nocturnal and
Well,
butterflies are.
I joke about this among my butterfly friends, and I tell them that butterflies are nothing more than day-flying moths. They're very, very similar. To look at them in the field, particularly if you use those little close focusing binoculars, an obvious difference is in the tip of the antennae. The butterflies, and we have slides of this, but we didn't include it. The tip of the antennae of butterflies are little knob-like structures or spatula shaped. They're widened. In moths, there's essentially two types of antennae. One is just like a thread with no knob at the end, or like a feather with barbs coming off. So the antennae are the easiest way to tell them apart. But a lot of butterflies, a lot of moths fly during the day. You can see them during the day. So that's not a good distinction necessarily. A lot of people think moths are dull, but moths can be extremely beautiful. We have many species that are just marvelously colored and patterned. Moths are becoming a big thing now. The study of moths. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've been doing it since 2001 here at my house. I've got 20 years worth of photographs and data on moths.
Yeah,
Great.
where we've had 84 species of butterflies in our garden, which is probably a state record. Wade has had nearly 1,200 species of moths in less
Well,
time.
Maybe we have to do another program on moths.
Oh, I love it.
Wade's got moth programs galore.
And we'll bring Blaine Rothhauser, who is also quite a moth fan. Well, I want to thank you, Sharon and Wade. This has been very educational, very informative, very wonderful, and it's always great to talk to you. I want to tell everybody that all of our webinars are recorded. We take out the pauses, edit out the little technical things that always happen, and these are on our YouTube channel for on-demand viewing. Just go to New Jersey Highlands Coalition on YouTube. You'll find the whole series of our webinars. And we are the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. We fight to protect the natural and cultural resources of the New Jersey Highlands, and we're fortunate enough to have dedicated people like Sharon and Wade Wander to work with us and help us in this mission. We'd love you to come to our website, njhighlandscoalition.org, find out more about us, and perhaps what we really enjoy is if you become a member and join us. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks for the invitation, Elliot.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, guys.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.